Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. It is Sunday night and it is time for one word. Time that we gather on Sunday nights and we talk about one word for the week that we spotlight, just one word that would perhaps help us to become a better leader. Now, if you're watching and you're saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not a leader, I'm a follower, or I don't have a job that, I have a title and I have a whole bunch of people working for me. Let me change your framework or your perspective or give you a little paradigm shift. Leadership is not a title. Leadership is not um, how many names you have underneath you. Leadership is influence. And I know you've heard that before. I didn't create that, but it is influence. So unless you kind of live under a rock and you don't have any interaction with other people, you are a leader because you have the ability to influence others. And so we are gathering to really talk about this idea of one word because I think sometimes we complicate leadership so much and we complicate our influence so much. And so we're just going to carve it down to one word a week that we might put a spotlight on that could be a blind spot and could be something that we need to shine some light on for the week to help us to grow and our ability to influence others. So let's look at the word for this week, and here we go. The word is listening. Now, I think we all can agree with what's going on in our country. That it really comes down to this word, and I didn't necessarily pick this word for that reason. It's one that I sort of had planned ahead of time, but it comes down. If you flip on the news media, if you flip on the events that are happening, the frustration. I listened to a message this morning from someone who talked about the feelings of what's happened in our country, being angry and frustrated and so forth. But if you carve away all those layers, it comes down to the inability for two parties to really listen to each other. I mean, it's just it seems like a simple solution, but when you walk away or feel unheard, you feel unrespected, disrespected, I guess you would say. And that's the problem when we have a poor listening. I think it's an issue in leadership. For example, here's a little cartoon there, in one ear and out the other. We've all had situations like that, right? Where we've worked perhaps for someone or had a relationship with someone as a manager. And as we communicated, we knew it didn't stick. It was in one ear and out the other. So it's a huge leadership crisis. It's also a crisis in marriage and relationships. This one, I don't know if you can read all this, but at the bottom, there's that husband and wife. It says, "I'm sorry, dear, I wasn't listening. Could you repeat what you've said since we've been married?" We've been married. So that's a common thing that can happen. I know Stacy and I have been married for a long time. I was going to tell you the years, but I don't want to get put on the spot here. Over 30, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood. But there's probably been times where she has said to me, "You're not listening," or she probably thought that. And I might have done the same with her. Same thing with relationships. I've seen relationships become fractured because people don't listen. And so when you don't listen, you allow someone to connect dots that aren't there. And so it's just a huge issue. Hey, what I want to ask you to do, if you would, if you're on and you're watching, looks like we've got a group, post something in the comments about your experience with listening. Yeah, maybe rate yourself, or on a scale of 1 to 10, you a good listener, not a good listener. Go ahead and put that in the comments for me, and let's talk about that. We'll spend a couple minutes at the end, or if you have some suggestions as to the best way to listen or tips that you've learned over the years, we're going to spend some time talking about some that I've got laid out for you. But put those in the comments, and let's spend a minute or two talking about that. Let me put a couple of quotes up. I love quotes that make you think and so forth. So let's put a couple. First of all, before I do that, I jumped ahead. I almost forgot about this slide. I love this slide because it talks about really how with leaders, it's a huge blind spot. It's an area where leaders, I don't in that picture. I mean, I know their eyes are kind of, it looks like they're closed almost. Eyes are closed, headphones are on, drowning out the world. Recently I was listening to something, and I was listening to the leader talk, and they made some comments, and I told some people afterwards. They said, "What did you think?" And it was a group, and I said, "I think they've lost touch with reality." You know, that's one of the things that can happen when you forget to make listening a priority. So now let's look at a couple of these quotes. First of all, one of the most sincere forms of respect is actually listening to what another person has to say. That's probably one of the top things that I would mention in regards to the benefit of listening, is to show respect, or the lack of listening, which is really showing disrespect for someone else. It doesn't take a lot of effort, although it can be hard when we're distracted. But showing respect is really probably at the top of the list when you actually show someone that you're listening to them. Let's look at the next quote here. Have you ever been guilty of this? Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. You ever had that happen? You know, you're listening, and you're sort of halfway listening, but the only reason that you're really engaged is because you're planning your reply. You're trying to plan what you're going to say, and you're waiting for them to pause so you can hijack the agenda of the conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about my listening journey. When I was younger, and really until probably in my 20s or so, I was what you might call a robot listener. A robot listener means, I just sort of coined that thinking about it as I was putting this together. Robot listener means that I wanted you to know that I was really engaged in listening, but I really didn't hear a word you said. I was young, in my teens, and I was at this large gathering, and I remember my parents were there, and I was sitting on the front row, and there was happened to get in the front row, and there was a speaker, and I wanted to prove to him that I was listening. And so I would nod, and I would lean in, and my eyes would get big, and I would laugh, when he said something funny. But afterwards, and he actually came up and he said, "Wow, you were really engaged." Made me feel so good. But if you had asked me, "Hey, what did he say?" I had no clue, because I wasn't really listening with my ears. I was wanting to prove to him that I was listening, and that's all I cared about, was his approval. We've had that, right? Where we listen to somebody and we hear them, say, "Yeah, okay, yeah, right. Oh, yeah, absolutely." But about halfway through the conversation, we know they're not paying attention. So don't be a robot listener. All right, let's walk through 6 tips that I've got for you before we leave, and I see some comments, so I'm gonna pop those up in a minute. So we'll talk about those at the end. But here we go. Number 1, listen to learn, not to be polite. All right. So here's the thing: when you're listening, yes, you are showing respect, and there is a bit of politeness that you're demonstrating, but you're really listening to learn. What can you learn about the other person? Sometimes we think that learning is just words. That learning is also the posture, the tone, the mannerisms that the person is giving. Sometimes it's not what they say, it's what's beneath what they say that you can learn from. So when you get to the end of the day and you rethink, or you kind of go back and reflect on the conversations that you had for that day, ask yourself, what did I learn in each of those conversations? And if your answer is, "Well, I really didn't learn anything," chances are you really didn't listen. All right, number 2, quiet your mind, your personal agenda, and your devices, right? I mean, quiet all of those things. You just have to close that down. I know sometimes when someone interrupts you, it's hard to shut it all off, but try to do that. The device thing, I think, is most critical, and it blows me away. When I'm sitting with someone, first of all, I silence my phone, but I turn it over. I turn it down, face down on the table. Instead of even keeping it in my pocket sometimes, if I have it, because I want them to know I am not going to pay attention to my phone. I don't want to get distracted by something, a note coming in and so forth. I used to know a leader that when we were meeting and so forth, always would have his phone on. And anytime a text came in or a phone call, he would stop and answer it. He would stop and look at the text, and then he would respond. So if he was, kind of where the conversation was being directed to, if he was who we were talking to, everybody had to stop because it was pretty evident that he was not paying attention. So meetings would start and stop and start and stop as a result of opening that phone and responding to things. So quiet that electronic device. All right, number 3, ask questions. Ask questions, back to number 1, to learn, not ask questions just to ask questions. We've all been interrogated, right? We've all had that thing where someone's asking questions and you're thinking, wow, they're really interested. But then you come to learn that they really weren't interested. They're just trying to keep the conversation going because they didn't like silence. So they just continue to ask a question. But when you're asking questions, ask questions because you truly are curious about what the answers are going to be. So always make sure you include questions in your agenda. Number 4, look for a small personal thing to follow up. Now this is one of my favorites. I don't do it well all the time. But when I'm having a conversation with someone, if there's a little small thing, maybe it doesn't even have to do with the agenda of the conversation, I try to remember that. A lot of times I have to write it down afterwards. And then if I'm going to send that person an email, or sometimes if it's a new client and I'm writing them a note, maybe a card that I send them, I try to recall that little bitty nugget that they mentioned. And what that says it wasn't the main part of the conversation, but what it says to them is, wow, he was really paying attention to me. So it just, and if you're not sending a note, maybe the next time you have a conversation, you can say, hey, what about your son? I heard you tell me about he was doing something. Or what about your dog? I heard you got a new dog. What's going on with that? If you are able to recall a small little thing, it can be huge in letting the person know that you truly are listening. All right, number 5. 2-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1 ratio of listening versus talking. So I know you've heard it. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen twice as much as we talk. So try to make sure, and if you're going to evaluate yourself at the end of a day and say, how well did I do listening today? Just kind of go back and think, did I listen twice as much as I talked? And if you didn't, chances are you were hijacking the conversation and you really weren't listening, asking questions, being engaged, leaning in to the conversation. And then the last one, don't interrupt, right? And here's another one, don't complete the other person's sentences. This happens so much, where you're talking and maybe you get enthused about what they're saying. And so what you end up doing is you want to complete their sentences for them. You want to move the conversation. Allow the other person to communicate to you in the tone, in the mannerisms, in the speed, if they're struggling to get a word, allow them to get it out. There may be a reason that they're struggling to get that. Don't ruin that moment by trying to complete their sentences. I was watching something it was an interview. It was a husband and wife. I won't mention who they are. They were on Jimmy Fallon about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so he was talking to them and the husband kept talking and he would be about halfway through the sentence and the wife would interrupt and complete the rest of the sentence. And then he would say something else and she would interrupt and complete. And finally, if you looked at his face at the end of the interview, this is a pretty famous couple. He looked pretty dejected. I mean, it was almost like, why should I say anything? I can't even get a word in edgewise. So don't interrupt. Don't complete sentences. All right, there's your 6 things. Let's look at our time. We got another minute or two. Let me look at some of these comments and see. So let's see what we've got here. Christian says, I'm better listener than I used to be, but still need lots of improvement. Don't we all? Lori, she tells me, oh, this is good. So Lori's telling me that got married. I see our, let's move these over here so you can see them maybe a little bit better. She says, I got married in 1985, but that still doesn't tell me how many years, Lori. Thank you. I know I got married in 1985, but I don't know how many years. Carly says, I feel like it depends on who I'm listening to. Well, that's true. There are some people that are hard to listen to. Carly might be talking about her father. Who knows? Oh, this is really good. This marriage thing I knew would get me in trouble. So there's Stacy, my wife, telling me it's 35 years in July. I at least knew it was over 30. So that's good. All right. Christian says, being a business owner has been the biggest reason that I realized I needed to get better at listening. My poor wife's been telling me for years, but I wasn't really paying attention. Exactly. Yeah, we've all been there, particularly us guys, right? Suzanne says, in my profession, being a good listener is crucial. Certainly, in Suzanne's world, in the HR world, shutting out all distractions is helpful to me. Meaning no TV, no music, no social media, while active listening. Absolutely, we've got to quiet those distractions, and Suzanne is a good listener. I can attest to that. Carly says too, it's hard to listen to someone you don't have a lot of respect for, and that's true. That's true. I get that. But here's one thing to challenge, and I probably would be the hardest to do, is to challenge yourself to make a game out of it, to say, hey, I'm going to listen and see if there's one thing I can learn that I didn't know before, even though I may not have respect with that person. Christian says, the Covey quote, the best description of my listening weakness. The Covey quote, we'll put that, but most people do not listen without the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. And Cindy says, listen is definitely a learned skill. I love that. Absolutely. It is a learned skill. It's not, I'm not sure people are natural born listeners. We have to practice it. We have to learn how to do it. There's sometimes I know there's people that I've talked to that I'll say, okay, I'm gonna maintain eye contact, and I'm gonna hang in, and I'm gonna listen to every word, and I'm gonna do the best I can. And sometimes I just can't get to the end for whatever reason. I get distracted. So absolutely, it is a muscle that we have to use and we have to practice in order to grow. All right, so that's the tip for tonight. I have a closing statement for you that I want to put up, and I'll leave you with this. It's basically, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Listen first, speak second. Listening shows how much you care. So they don't care how much you know. They don't need to hear. When in my business, we talk about being a guide for clients, and we talk about there's two buckets that guide responsibility comes out. One is empathy, the other is authority. And we should always lead with empathy, which is listening, and then we can follow with authority, which is our mouth. And I always say the more empathy we demonstrate, the less authority we have to use. All right, practice listening this week. So just, kind of practice, put it in the spotlight, see what you can do, see if you can improve on that. And I really appreciate you joining. Hope you'll join next week. We're going to try to do this every Sunday. Next week it's going to be at 8 o'clock instead of 7. I actually have a meeting, and I got to push it back an hour, but I'll send links out and so forth. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. Make it a good day.